Nordics were really in awe of the trouble you've gone to. Thank you very much. In fact, we come to think of Leicester as the sort of hospitality capital of the UK, because when we came here 2 years ago, we visited the Tigers and had a really good time with the Tigers as well. I'm really here to introduce our overview of what we do. I'm going to hand over to the boys to talk about some of the specifics of what's coming out next. I'm going to try and skip through some of the stuff that's already published. I won't spend a lot of time on. Ultimately, we've got some really interesting stuff that's about to be published, which I think can potentially make some contribution to inroads into hamstring strain in the future. So first of all, in terms of who we are, we took this photo 2 years ago, and this is really the core of our group. And we have to come to the UK nowadays to get the team back together. So Morgan, who's up the back, has been a part of this group all the way through. I first met Morgan when he was an Aussie, well, trying to be an Aussie in Melbourne some years back. The other guys here, Dave was an undergrad student. In fact, all the boys, Dave, Matty Bourne, and Ryan, have been undergrad students of mine at some stage. So I've hopefully taught them a little bit about some functional anatomy at some stage and not put them off too much. But Dave went on to do his PhD with me at QUT. He's now an academic in his own right at Australian Catholic University in Melbourne. So we have this advantage now that we're sort of split geographically into 2 different labs, which really doesn't mean the quality of work we can do has gone up significantly. We'd all be competing for rather than limited lab space if we were all in one institution. We've both got teams. I've got 2 extra on here now, so I've got 6 postgrads. I've got some really, really capable postgrads with Dave in Melbourne as well. Okay, so ultimately though, the work, most of what you'll hear about today has come from this core group of people. Obviously, as a research priority, we've been thinking about hamstring strains for a while. We've had 12 hamstring publications since 2012. We started off with Dave's Lit Review, which was a sports medicine paper. We've had 11 publications since. We've probably got about 6 in press at the moment, so halfway through the year we're going to get to 18 pretty quickly. We're starting publishing some good journals, so we're starting to get that traction that you get. We used to get rejected outright, I think, when we sent out stuff to some journals initially. Now we're getting a gig, or getting at least a read. I'm not going to worry too much about each of these topics, I'm just going to get straight into it. First of all, instrumenting the Nordic hamstring device. For me, we've always had isokinetic dynamometry in any of the labs that I've worked at over the years. And obviously, isokinetic dynamometers can do some fantastic things. It's just that when you want to test a whole AFL team, which is a squad of about 44 people, it's going to take you 2.5 days to get through that group. And that means the club can probably afford to do it once a year, if then. And they're pretty frustrated spending that much time with guys waiting around for a lab test. So whilst we love isokinetics, it's very time consuming. So it requires a great deal of expertise. And I personally, I've been to some of the labs that have punched out. You know, we have isokinetic research which shows that these measures are predictive of hemistrain. For every paper we have which says it is predictive, we have another paper which says it's not predictive. I've had the pleasure or displeasure, if you like, to be in some of the labs where they have found no predictive capacity with isokinetics. And I see the way they do their isokinetic testing, and I'm no surprise at all that it correlates with nothing in the real world, because I don't think they test well. And ultimately, I think that a lot of people think that testing strength is easy. And ultimately, testing strength on a dynamometer is not easy. You require significant expertise. You could have a handheld dynamometer as an alternative, and that again requires some really significant experience. So Rod here in this picture, Rod's a great advocate of, as is Rod Whiteley from Aspartame, he's a great advocate of handheld dynamometry. I personally think we've got some athletes that he could not operate his handheld dynamometer on. We've got some big, strong boys who simply wouldn't allow him to pull that knee into extension. So there's limitations, obviously, to both of these devices. Lab-based time demands, your experience. Of course, they've got reliability published for all of them, and we've got to think about some alternatives. So ultimately, where the nordbord was born, basically from a photograph like this, if not this photograph, or this image. This is Arne Arneson's study, the first one. It's not a randomised controlled trial, it's an intervention study in which they got a very large group of Norwegian and Icelandic footballers, and those who did Nordics in pre-season, 3 times a week, and then maintenance once a week throughout the season, had 60% fewer injuries. But when I look at this exercise, I get really frustrated because I'm a numbers person in the gym. I want to know how many sets, how many reps, and what load did I lift, if it's a bench, or if it's a squat, or if it's a power clean. And I hate the idea of, one, this guy can't really give me much feedback. There's no force, no performance feedback there. So ultimately, I use load cells for a long, long time. Part of my undergrad studies use load cells. From a PhD, I did twitch interpolation with big quadriceps, and we use load cells all the time. It just seemed really obvious that you would attach this to here and get a measurement. And I felt that it must be 10, 15, 20 lads in the world who've done that. And as it turned out, we've gone through this patent process. We've made a lot of noise about our hamstring device, and no one said, oh, we thought of that first. So we feel like we're onto something. So we end up with a device. You know, there's one version of it. We've got 57 different ways it could look, and downstairs we've got 2 different embodiments of how this thing looks. And personally, I really like the blue one that you guys have got. That's the one that we've collected most of our data with, and it's the one that really gets the job done, I think. Ultimately, we want to attach some sort of ankle restraint, whether it's a hook or whether it's an ankle strap like we had downstairs, 2 load cells, get some feedback out of that. And ultimately, this is on slow mo, otherwise it's not really as impressive. So we typically, in all the research we've done so far, we get people to repeat that 2 more times. So we get 3 max reps, we've got to take a rest between them, or we just get people to do 3 of those. And the idea was to simply impose as little time as possible upon clubs. So now we've gone from a dynamometer test, which was taken 2.5 days, and now we get through an AFL club in about 2 hours. So the club can therefore do it more often. Some of the clubs have their own device, some of the clubs use it every single week, some clubs use it a little less often. But ultimately it's far less intrusive of time. So there's an example of the force outputs. Obviously you've got left and right leg getting measured independently at the same time. And we can either take the average of the 3, which we've done in some of our studies, or we can just take a single peak. And ultimately, within these 3 reps, usually most people have got their best effort. You know, if you're very rare for someone to need a 4th effort one to get their max. Obviously, when we have these measurements, we've got eccentric force at the ankle. We can multiply that by shank length and work out a knee flexor torque. We've got an imbalance measure as well, and we've basically looked at both of these things. So I think initially some of our thinking was that imbalance would be the best predictor, and as it turns out, in some studies, force or knee flexor torque is a better predictor of injury, and in other studies, imbalance seems to be. So I'll skip through this pretty quickly. The big plus so far with this is that you don't need a lot of experience as a tester. Ultimately, if your participants can do Nordics, and they're trained at Nordics for some period of time, this is just a different place to do Nordics on. And it's a really secure place to do Nordics on, so often people actually feel like they get more, you know, go slower, get more force on it. But ultimately, if people can do Nordics, people can do this test, and you as a tester don't necessarily need a great deal of expertise. Although I always think it helps to be able to give the right cues. We get some guys who do a test and they tuck up, basically, put their forehead pretty much 2 inches in front of their knees and fall forward, and they're not getting as much force as they should. From a reliability perspective, we've published some early reliability stuff, but I've got some more recent reliability data which matches the devices that we have these days. Dave initially had a very primitive prototype which he did some really good reliability stuff with early, but we've got some better devices now and reliability is a little bit higher. So, because I wanted to potentially run the risk of losing my voice and getting the voice to take over, I'm going to talk about my topics for the day. And one of them is this concept of neuromuscular inhibition following hamstring strain injury. Ultimately, this was a suggestion that we made in 2013 in a paper that we had in the Journal of Electromyography and Kinesiology. It's a review paper. And basically we argued that inhibition after injury is going to be a significant characteristic of hamstring strain in the same way that's a characteristic of anterior cruciate ligament strain, anterior cruciate ligament rupture. But it hadn't been recognised at the time we were writing this. So this is a model that we've presented, and I've altered a couple of things on it. But basically we argue that with hamstring strain, of course, there's some degree of pain. With pain, it's typically neuromuscular inhibition. With neuromuscular inhibition, you can ignore the tick mark there for a moment. That's going to directly cause weakness. This weakness is characterised by being greater in eccentric actions than it is in concentric or isometric actions. And ultimately, the sensitivity of any test of strength, if there's any pain involved, an eccentric test will be a much more sensitive indicator that there's something wrong than will an isometric or a concentric test. And so that's really why I'm very biased towards eccentric tests of some sort, if indeed you think there might be some degree of inhibition involved. And this weakness, preferentially eccentric, also exhibits itself particularly along the muscle legs. And that's something that the original figure didn't indicate. It's just got this asterisk and that will read down below. One other thing that happens with hamstring injury is that early rehab we tend to avoid long lengths for understandable reasons. But muscle fascicle lengths will tend to shorten if you keep them short for too long. And then you get a shorter optimum muscle length, which increases your propensity for muscle damage. And ultimately, we've got now some evidence which is beefing up various parts of this schematic. So it's a model. We understand that it's a working model, like most working models. We get some way through testing it and find some problems with it. And we might find some major problems that are terminal. We have to toss the whole thing out. But at the moment, what we're finding is not causing us to toss it yet. So first of all, one of Dave's PhD studies looked at surface EMG during eccentric and concentric actions on a dynamometer and found significant evidence for inhibition in people with a prior history of injury. So on their injured leg, their eccentric activation is far poorer than on their good leg. We had that data, sat on it for a while, then Dave had a bit of a stroke of genius in thinking that we could also look at the rate at which torque is developed during those eccentric actions and the rate at which EMG onset occurs in those eccentric actions. And that is also showing us that there's significant reductions. I'm not going to spend much time on those because they're out there, they've been published for a few years now, and people can grab them if they need. But basically, this gives us confidence that we can tick off here. I'll give you a couple of newer bits of evidence for ticking this off as well. And then, quite recently, Ryan's shown that people with a history of unilateral hamstring injury also have shortened muscle fascicles on the injured side by comparison with the uninjured side. And in fact, Ryan's stuff, I probably should not beat him up too much because if he disappoints later, it'll be all downhill. But ultimately, his PhD shown some really interesting stuff in muscle architecture. And I think that will help us start to explain some stuff which hasn't been explained yet, and hopefully lets it make a dent in hamstring injury. Okay, now there's other aspects of that which we haven't looked at. We're actually going to be inducing pain experimentally, deliberately, at some stage in the next year or so with the new PhD students coming on soon. We're just going to inject boluses of saline into various parts of the hamstring and having a look at the acute effect that pain alone has in the absence of any damage. Some of the work that Matthew Vaughan has been doing, this one has just been submitted, and the next one I'll show you is, I think it's just going to fall over the line and get accepted in the next day or so. We basically used magnetic resonance imaging because we've used EMG a little bit. We've used some twitch interpolation in the lab as well, by the way, and twitch interpolation tends to give us the same results as our EMG estimates. But MRI gives you this capacity to look inside the muscle and actually see what segments of the muscle have been particularly active and which segments have been less active. In this particular study, we got 10 elite to sub-elite athletes. Most of them are elite, by the way. Most of them have competed for Australia and many of them have competed at World Championship level. Many in track and field, but there's some decent level football code players in there as well. On average, they're 9 months post-injury. They've all returned to full training. They're all doing full competition schedule again. They're as recovered as we think they can be, and they're as recovered as they think they can be. And we've had these guys do 3 sets of 6 40-metre sprints out of the Queensland University, which is a neighbouring institution to ours. And we're very, very lucky there because at the back of their centre of advanced imaging, where the scanner sits, they actually have a cricket open. So we can do the last sprint again, follow through into the back door and get into the scanner within a minute and a half. And that's really, really rare. It's rare in the world to be able to do running like that so close to a scanner. But we need to be able to take these scans pre-running, have them get out and run, and then get them back in the scanner as fast as we possibly can. And like with a lot of our studies, these are all people with a history of unilateral strain injury. In this particular study, just the biceps femoris long head, which of course is the site that you'll most often injure as a consequence of high-speed sprinting. And so, we'll just cut to the results straight away. If we look at post-sprint changes in what's called the T2 image is reflective of the amount of glycolysis that has occurred in the previous several minutes. And ultimately, we know that because patients with McArdle's disease, who simply don't have much in the way of anything in the way of glycolysis, don't have a T2 change as a consequence of exercise. We know it's associated very closely with fluid shifts into from certain muscle compartments into other muscle compartments. So as glycolytic byproducts build up, fluid moves into that area in accordance with osmosis. You end up with not only a T2 change, but you end up with swelling of the muscle as well. Now, if we consider first of all just what's happening with the uninjured limb, we have a look at bicep femoris long head and semitendinosus. These are the muscles that are most activated as a consequence of overground running. We have semimembranosus, just that little bit less active, and the short head of bicep femoris, rather inactive by comparison with the others. Okay, so this is the extent of muscle use, the extent to which these muscles have performed glycolysis in the previous 18 sprints. Okay, so that's normal running. And then what happens to the uninjured leg by comparison? Remember, in this case, every single person here has injured bicep femoris long head in the past. You can see the level of muscle activation there, or muscle use, the degree of glycolysis that's occurred. It's markedly less in the previously injured bicep fem long head. Now, at that point there, that's the sort of story we expected to be able to tell. You can see over here, semimembranosus, there's no significant change at all. The semitendinosus exhibited also a significant reduction in activation. And our model of the universe had been very, very simple up until now. The previously injured muscle was inhibited, and now we're starting to see it's not just the previously injured muscle, but also in this case, the semitendinosus, which seems to be the other major hamstring activator in sprinting, is also inhibited. Okay, so that data has just been submitted, and ultimately it tells us something in terms of the story. If you're 9 months post-injury, you think you're fine, and fundamentally you are not activating two of your major knee flexors and hip extensors in sprinting. Okay, some of all these guys are well trained. This is not as if they're recreational slobs who just haven't rehabilitated properly. There are guys here, there's a guy in this study who's an 8-metre long jumper, just won the national championship back home. So we've got some really serious athletes training at a really good level. As I said, world junior championship, world championship level for at least 7 of them. Okay, so if this degree of reduced muscle use can persist that long, there's something missing from rehab. And the first thing missing is a recognition that it's happening in the first place. Obviously, if we knew it was happening, we might actually then try and develop strategies to fix it. Okay, so one other thing that you might do a little bit of as an athlete is do some Nordics. And in this particular study, a similar study, separate study though, 10 recreational sub-elite athletes. These guys are not quite so highly trained. They're on average 10 months post-injury. We had them do 6 sets of 10 Nordics, pre and post MRI. And a lot of people say, why do 6? And I say, don't you guys do 6? It's just Australia, we do 6 of everything. But we basically, when we're paying a lot of money for MRI scans, we're going to want to have a definite response in the muscle. So we subsequently have done this with lower volumes to get very similar results. Okay, now with these guys, they were a mixture. 7 presented with prior bicep fem long head strain, 2 semitendinosus strain, and 1 was a semimembranosus strain. So that created some statistical issues, but nevertheless, we've got this published in the Scandinavian Journal Scando at the moment. But post-Nordics, the T2 changes. In this particular case, we're just looking at uninjured muscle versus injured muscle. And you can see again, there's a significant difference here in the extent of muscle use for that muscle that had been previously injured. So in this particular case, this is a graph which is made up of the 7 bicep fems and the 2 semitendinoses and the 1 semimembranosus. We can do the same stats just with the 7 bicep fem injuries and we get the same results. So it doesn't seem to be too very much muscle specific. You injure a muscle, it's inhibited. And again, you're doing Nordics, you're nearly 10 months into recovery, and you're getting significantly less muscle use out of a muscle that you think you're targeting. So you run differently, and you do your gym work differently, and as a consequence, you're probably missing out on some significant adaptation that should be occurring. And this is the way I like to try and explain it, because a lot of people say, well, Tony, if you're inhibited, surely you can't harm a muscle that is inhibited. The muscle's completely paralysed, I imagine it's pretty difficult to strengthen anything. But ultimately, we want to imagine for the moment, returning to play without any inhibition. Post-injury, of course, there's early rehab and there's not much, in terms of intensity of eccentric hamstring actions, there's not a lot happening. And progressively that increases. And I think we recognise that for many sports people, going from reach, they're back in training now, so they're out of the care perhaps of primarily the physio, and now they're back with the S&C coach. But there's a bit of a step up here between what you do in training and what you do in competition. And I think probably really, really good management of athletes, you basically see a little bit more of this very high intensity stuff in training as well. But that's what should happen without inhibition. And of course there'll be some positive adaptations happening as a consequence of that. You should gain eccentric strength if you're progressively bumping up the intensity of eccentric work that you do. You should probably enhance voluntary activation, although we've presented evidence to say that's not improving. Should be improving muscle size if indeed you lost any. You should be, with this eccentric stimulus, increasing fascicle lengths, because you will lose fascicle length with any degree of injury and reduced activity, and you need to get your fascicles back out to longer lengths. There's other possibilities as well. We know that we alter collagen expression in tendons with eccentric exercise, and there's no reason why we couldn't alter collagen expression inside muscle as well. It's just not when no one's bothered to look at that yet. But also there's an enhancement in damage resistance. Muscles become less likely to be damaged as a consequence of subsequent eccentric overload. And so I think this final point is something that's much ignored. We tend to think too much, I think, in this area about strength. We're here today telling you about a strength testing device partly and some of our strength-oriented research. But I don't think necessarily that enhancement in the eccentric strength is the only part of this story. But what happens if you return to play with the inhibition that we've just presented some evidence for? And we would argue that inhibition is very, very robust. That a very high proportion of athletes coming back from a hamstring strain of grade 2 or more will have some degree of inhibition. So if we look at semi-mem, semi-10 and a bicep femoris longhead that has been injured, then my sort of model of this is that early on in rehab we've got low intensities of eccentric activity, and this is an inhibited muscle. It's not participating as you think it might. So you might be doing all the right tasks, but you've got to ask yourself the question, what is bicep femoris contributing to those tasks? And it seems that you can do reasonably good Nordics and reasonably good sprinting without bicep fem longhead that you've injured being much of a contributor. So my view is here, you've done retraining, someone thinks you're better, someone wants to put you back on the field. Ultimately, only in competition will you find that really, really important contest. You have to get to the ball first, as a guy next to you is hungrier than you, or just as hungry as you, and he wants to get the ball as well. Ultimately, it's at this point where I think you put your foot flat to the floor. You basically ask something of a muscle that's not adapted to do. It doesn't have the fascicle lengths to protect it, doesn't have the damage resistance, it doesn't have the strength. You can't activate it perhaps as you should. And ultimately, I think it's at that point where we get a lot of hamstrings that go and restrain. So ultimately, inhibition, in my view, sabotages rehabilitation, and ultimately leads to muscles that just aren't quite prepared for the heavy rigours of either very, very intense training or competition. Now, here's the model again, but I've stripped off the top part of it because we're growing increasingly certain that don't have to have a prior injury to suffer inhibition in certain circumstances. So we've shown with, this is again another of Ryan's studies, this one was his honours study of work, yeah. So as an undergrad, he performed a study in which we got a group of guys and we induced some running fatigue, and we showed that in the bicep femoris only, there was some significant neuromuscular inhibition. And that neuromuscular inhibition explained the strength loss eccentrically that these guys experienced really, really well. I think the relationship between the two was like 0.69, 0.7, okay? 0.71. So ultimately, inhibition that we measured, in this case on a dynamometer with EMG and during eccentric actions, and comparing those eccentric actions to concentric actions, the level of inhibition really quite well explained the eccentric weakness. Okay, so all athletes run, whether or not you've had a history of injury, there is a risk with a lot of high-speed sprinting that you end up with some degree of inhibition, which may or may not contribute to injury risk. In this case, it would not be re-injury, it would be first-time injury. Also here, muscle architecture. We've just shown, again through Ryan's work down in Melbourne today, that muscle fascicle lengths play a critical role in injury. And ultimately, there's been good reasons to believe that, and people have thought about the torque joint angle relationship as a surrogate measure of this, but ultimately it's a surrogate measure. That's the direct anatomical correlate of injury risk in our view. So, we can have some people with no history of injury at all, and they happen to have short fascicles. It's a little bit hard to explain why some of them have such short fascicles, but they do, they get injured more often than people with longer fascicles. Okay, so some of the work that we've been doing quite recently, I have a master's student here, it wasn't mentioned earlier. We've been looking a little bit at the kinetics of the Nordic hamstring curl, because a lot of people, of course, have looked at kinematics, but with the lack of capacity to look at forces, I think they've been telling a quarter of the story quite often. So rather than tell you terribly much about the methods for this, I'm going to show you the results. I'll talk backwards very briefly about the methods by which we produce them, but just for the sake of getting through it quickly, I won't bog you down too much with it. First of all, though, we looked at reliability here. We had 32 people perform Nordics on 3 separate occasions. So the first visit, they were basically doing the same thing on every visit to the lab. They would come in, they would do 6 warm-up contractions and 3 maximum efforts. So the 3 maximum efforts were just like the tests that we typically use with our athletes in our prospective studies. The warm-ups, we give them a couple of minutes after they've done some warm-ups. We just basically ask them subjectively to judge 50% effort, build that effort up over time, get a 95% effort out in their last warm-up, and then do 3 max efforts. So they familiarised themselves, they had 2 weeks off, and then came back to the lab for test 1. And they repeated exactly what they did in the famil, and then they had 2 weeks off again, and they came back in and did test 2. Now, part of what we're interested in here is in the learning effect. So this was a group of people who, quite a few of them had done some Nordics before, but none of them were athletes, none of them use Nordics regularly. And so if we have a look at some talk, there's something of a learning effect between test 1 and test 2, despite the fact that we've done a famil session. The famil session is very, very brief, obviously, just 3 max efforts. So the effect size there for the increase in torque is 0.16. In fact, there's a statistically significant improvement in strength between those 2 tests. But the intra-class correlation is pretty good anyway, because it's 0.97 with a 95% confidence range of 0.93 to 0.98. Now, the typical error expressed as a percentage of coefficient variation is 5.3. So we looked at the sum torque, we looked at left leg torque, and we looked at right leg torque. Just to explain briefly why we did all those things, you would perhaps think that left torque plus right torque will give you sum torque. We're actually interested in instantaneous summed torque, because that's the parameter that dictates how fast you fall. Quite often, when the sum of the 2 legs torque is at its maximum, you find that the left is not at its maximum and the right is not at its maximum. Perhaps the left reached a maximum a few moments before, the right reaches the maximum a few moments after. But relatively few people will have peak torque in both legs in 1 millisecond of each other. So left leg and right leg torque gave very similar sorts of results. There's an effect size there. It's statistically significant. There was an improvement in strength. And that's something you need to take into account, obviously, if you do have people who are pretty fresh and new to the exercise. But again, intra-class correlations are very high. The typical errors are rather low. But in addition to these torque measurements, we had a goniometer on the left knee, and we looked at angle of peak torque. So it's just the knee angle at which these guys experience their peak torque. I think that's of interest because it didn't seem to change much between sessions on average. There's nothing in the way of an effect there. But the reliability is poor. And that to me was a bit of a surprise. If you're getting rather reliable torque measurements, then we know that this torque-to-angle relationship would dictate that torque should be somewhat dependent on angle, but in this particular case, the reliability of our angle measurement at that peak torque was really, really low. The velocity of the knee extension at peak torque was also rather low. Okay, so I think that's something that you can consider. I'm still scratching my head a little bit about it, but ultimately we have some people advocate using a breakpoint angle. So a point at which you suddenly start to accelerate. And for starters, some people never accelerate. Throughout the whole range of motion, they can maintain 60 degrees per second. So there is no breakpoint angle for those guys. And the breakpoint angle doesn't necessarily always tell you the angle at which people can get their peak torques. And ultimately, some of these angle measurements aren't that reliable for whatever reason. Basically, once we've crunched all that data, this is the result of 26 male participants who are part of that cohort. You can see here we've got the torque, some torque normalised to wherever its peak is in the range. And typically, for this group of people, they are reaching their peak torque around about 40-45 degrees. And obviously it's dropping away after that. The velocity at which they fall, these guys can maintain their forward velocity for around 15 degrees on average, and then they start to accelerate after that point. That was surprising to me because it always looks as if they're controlling their speed for a little bit longer throughout the range of motion. Obviously, as you get better at this, you can see people who can delay acceleration until later, but this is a group average, so it tends to push everyone into the mean, of course. And then in terms of EMG reaches its peak well before torque reaches its peak, and it starts to drop away quite sharply at that point. It's just a surface EMG measurement, so exactly how you interpret that is questionable. Ultimately though, we also, by the way, faintly here you can see left and right leg torques, because they're all normalised, they're basically all the same size, and they don't show any different sorts of shapes. Now, here's two people doing Nordic with the raw data output that we get. So I'll just talk you through that very quickly. At the top is left leg force, and there's right leg force. You see this individual close to me falling very, very slowly over a rather prolonged period of time, because the horizontal axis here is time. Okay, so starting at 4 seconds, reaching a peak torque at around 10 seconds. So it's nice, it's slow, it's controlled. Some people spend too much time, in my view, in the first 30 degrees. My personal view is, if you can control that, just get up to 45 degrees and start the business from there. You can see here lateral and medial EMG. We've got velocity of knee angle. This particular individual reaches his peak at 6 degrees per second. Very, very slow velocity. And then after that, starts to accelerate just a little bit. The knee angle here is 47 degrees from full extension. Over here we've got a chap who falls much faster. Interestingly though, the actual forces that are created are very, very similar. And once you work out shank length and work out torque, which we do post hoc, these two guys generate the same knee flexor torques. This is why I've chosen them and put them together. Over here, despite the same instructions, this guy's falling a whole lot faster. This guy reaches his peak torque here at 111 degrees per second of fall rate. It's basically diving to the ground. He ultimately manages, nevertheless, to put on the brakes reasonably well and reaches his peak torques at these high velocities. So I just wanted to show that from the perspective that there can be, even with the same set of instructions, there can be rather different techniques that people use when they perform a Nordic. They are not all performing the exact same pattern of movement. But I think in a lot of people's imaginations, this is the way that we imagine people doing in Nordic. Slow, 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 reaching a peaking torque, and then falling with a bit less resistance after that. And probably in our experience, this is probably the way that around half of our participants do the exercise, and around half of them do it rather different. Now, the other thing that I think is most interesting about this data is we wanted to look at the effect of extra loads held to the chest on knee flexor torques during the week. So we had 5, 10, 15 or 20 kilogram loads held by some reasonably strong individuals on the chest so that the bore of the weights plate was level with the xiphoid process, so that we could control the centre of mass of that extra load. So each of these guys did 10 MPCs. They did 2 with body mass and 2 with each of those extra loads. We averaged for the 2 repetitions with every load, so with 0, 5, 10, 15, 20 kilograms extra load, these are the average of 2 reps. I haven't bothered to put in all the pairwise comparisons because it makes for a bit of a pig's dinner. But ultimately, we can see that strength significantly increases up to around 15 kilograms of extra load. In this group of guys, it starts to plateau off. So there's a main effect of strength effect. Clearly there are some pairwise comparisons like this one and this one which don't get significant, but ultimately every extra load caused more force or more torque than was body mass alone. Here we've got the left and the right leg showing exactly the same patterns. So ultimately one of the questions we've often been asked is a body mass Nordic giving people your absolute true maximum knee flexor capacity? It's an eccentric test, and as it turns out, you add extra load, you do get extra forces. But it's a very different response from different individuals. So, for example, we've got 2 guys in this cohort whose best torque came with 20 kilograms extra load. They just kept getting stronger as we handed them extra load. We've got a couple of guys in this study. We gave them 5 kilograms, and they got extra torque. We gave them 10, and they're back to where they were at baseline. We gave them 15, and they're plummeting from a height and getting weaker and weaker. So it's a little bit independent upon your base level of strength. Some people can tolerate that more extra load and some people tolerate less extra load. But that may have some implications down the track. If you want to know what someone's absolute maximum capacity is, perhaps you need to load them up rather than simply do this with body mass. One thing we will say, all of our research so far prospectively is based on doing this with body mass. We've got some reasonably good results out of that. I think the correlation between body mass performance and if everyone did that same with 15 kilograms, you get pretty good correlation. Strong guys are still strong, weak guys are still weak. On average, with the 15 kilograms extra load, we've got about 12% extra torque by comparison with the resting or the body mass alone state. Now, with those extra loads, I was surprised to see that the joint angle of peak torque, whilst it's not necessarily a very reliable measure, it didn't seem to change at all with loading. But the velocity of peak torque did change significantly, and I've just drawn this so that the velocity is negative as you're falling. But ultimately, this is a group of guys who would fall at around 35 degrees per second when they reached their peak torque with body mass. As you gave them heavier loads, up to 15 kilograms at least, they fell faster. So they're now falling at around 72 degrees per second with that extra load. Ultimately, there was no change at all in EMG. So in terms of muscle activation, we can't say that you're clearly getting more activation with heavier loads than you were with light loads. We didn't expect there to be a change here. Ultimately, every rep here is a max effort. And it seems that EMG is plateaued out across this range of extra loads. So, we're left to ask a question, how can we get extra torque if EMG doesn't change and if the angle of peak torque doesn't change? Well, ultimately, we've got a bunch of guys who are falling slowly at around 35 degrees per second of knee extension. If you go back into the literature and look at isokinetic knee flexor testing, you find that 35 degrees per second tests tend to give you less torque than do tests around 60 degrees. So ultimately, we get more torque, very likely, because we're simply falling faster and we're lengthening the hamstrings at a higher rate. What that means, of course, though, because the torque-velocity relationship exhibits a plateau across most of the rates of lengthening, if indeed you're already falling around 60 degrees per second, and now you fall at 120 perhaps, because someone gives you an extra, like a horse to carry whilst you're doing your Nordic, ultimately you're going to reach a plateau there where you don't necessarily get any extra forces. So we've got a lot of AFL players who've done this test. They're not particularly strong. They're getting around 300 newtons on our device, where we tend to think that you should get 400 as a mature adult, perhaps even better than that. And yeah, apparently you guys are getting some really nice results. Ultimately, if you're really strong and you're in this range, extra load will give you extra torque. If you're weak, probably extra load makes no difference, and it may be just a silly thing to do to add extra load to Nordics in that circumstance. Alright, so quickly switch to some of our work on muscle and our hamstring muscle activity in different hamstring exercises. Ultimately, people often make the mistake of thinking that we're one-eyed Nordic supporters, and that we think that the only exercise athletes should do is a Nordic. And it's far from the case. I come from a strength and conditioning background, and Nordics would have been about the last thing I would ever have done as an S&C a long time ago. An S&C so long ago I hadn't done Nordics, I must admit. But Matty Bourne has looked recently at a raft of EMG studies followed by some MRI studies. And the next step after that, basically what we wanted to do is compare Nordics to something else. We weren't sure what to compare it to. Ultimately, we compared Nordics then to about 10 different exercises. And we shortlisted some. We took those to the MRI scanner to have a look spatially at where in the muscle we saw high levels of activity after those exercises. So I won't bore you with this, but basically this is one repetition of each of these exercises that we did. And we had lateral and medial EMG, and we smoothed that. Right down the bottom here, by the way, we've actually got a channel there which is telling us the ratio of lateral EMG to medial EMG. And it's over smoothed just so that we can see if a line is very, very low down on the page. This is preferentially a medial hamstring activator. If it's very high on the page, it's preferentially a lateral hamstring activator. One of the reasons we're interested in this is that everything we've done so far suggests to us that the Nordics is fantastically good at activating the medial hamstrings, and okay, but not brilliant at activating lateral hamstrings. Yet the Nordics is seen as there's evidence on the table that's reducing injuries in an amateur level, so sort of low levels of what Scandinavians might call leg soccer. And ultimately, we're really probably not training biceps femoris particularly hard with that exercise. But anyway, this is a starting point. I'll basically show you some of our results. We look at normalising EMG. There's always problems with EMG, so you've got to normalise it to something, and we've arbitrarily chosen resisted MVC. We actually get into the Nordic device, we lie our people prone, prone, and we have them do absolute maximum isometric knee flexion with knee pretty much straight, and we set them up at 90 degrees, we put our hands in their back and have them do repeat absolute maximum isometric knee flexion at 90 degrees in the knee. We normalised to both of those things. Ultimately here, some patterns you can see, we've got a range of different exercises that we looked at. The hip hinge might not be known to most of you. Basically it was a kettlebell swing without a kettlebell. So we didn't want to call it a kettlebell swing because we didn't have a kettlebell, but ultimately it's with a dumbbell, and ultimately the same sort of basic movement pattern of lifting the dumbbell, throwing it back between the legs. What you can see here though is this is the concentric phases of all these exercises. So there's no Nordic on here and there's no glute ham raise on here, because our guys can't do concentric phases in either of those exercises. But you can see with the leg curl, we've got high levels of hamstring activation, particularly of the medial hams. With a bridge 180 is basically a relatively straight knee bridge. So heel up on the box, trying to lift the hip up with a relatively straight knee. And we've got high levels of activation of hamstrings there. And then back extension. Basically had a 45 degree back extension device. We have people do unilateral extension of the hip. And in that particular case, it's quite decent levels of activation as well. We put the lunge in here. We put the lunge in there very, very specifically because Jordan Mendeguccia and his colleagues have, over some period of time, wanted to advocate for more functional hamstring tasks. They don't particularly like the Nordic, for example, because of the range of theoretical reasons why it shouldn't work. So lunge, we added that in, and ultimately you can see very, very low levels of activation. In all of these tasks, we're performing 6 reps with a 10 rep max load. So the lunge is done here with the same relative intensity as these other exercises. Now, I don't care how functional something is, if you get that level of activation, you can sit in a bus and just scratch one heel on the front of your shin, and you're going to get that level of activation. So, I personally have never been a great fan of lunging for hamstrings. I've seen some MRI evidence of hammies virtually showing no activity at all. At the end of the day, to say something's not functional and you're going to find a better functional alternative, you've got the responsibility then to work out that it actually involves the muscle at a significant level of activation. Now, we also took all of these, we were ultimately interested in lateral to medial hamstring activation. One other thing I'll mention about this, it'll probably be the last study we ever do when we look at EMG, lateral to medial hammy activation. One reason is Matt Zebus gets totally different results to us. And you can see tweets about her various conference presentations. If you take this pair of electrodes and you slide them from here to here, you go from being predominantly measuring bicep femoris long head to bicep femoris short head. You get vastly different results. And ultimately, that's the major limitation of surface imaging. Exactly where you put those electrodes will make a vast difference. So we're pretty careful to not put them too distally. If we look at lateral to medial EMG ratio across this scale, the lunge is the ultimate lateral hammy activator. But once again, it's selectively activating the muscle at 2/5 to 5/10 of bone roll intensity. So ultimately, where you are on this ratio doesn't mean a lot, but we've got leg curl here at a different end to our hip-oriented movements. And this is a pattern that we see time and time again where we're knee-based movements tend to be more medial in their activation pattern, and hip-based movements tend to be more lateral. So again, that's concentric phases for all those tasks. So if we look at the eccentric phases, now we can include glute ham raise and Nordic as well. Now, of course, this is an unfair comparison because the Nordic is a supramaximal task. It's probably 120% of what most people could do concentrically. So we're comparing here a 10 rep max load to a -1 max rep max load. So the glute ham raise, similarly, none of our guys could, or very few of them could get up through the concentric phase because we made them do the eccentric phase relatively slowly, and then they were stuck at the bottom. So it's an unfair comparison here to say that we've got high levels of EMG, but once again, we've got particularly high levels of medial hamstring activation in the eccentric phase of the Nordic. If we take a look at back extensions, we've got some decent levels of activation there, but the ratio of lateral to medial activation is different. So again, hip-based movements and knee-based movements show some different patterns. And here's our sliding scale of lateral to medial EMG. Back extension gave us the best activation of the lateral hammies. Nordics gave us the least. So basically, we just did these lists because we wanted to pick. We knew Nordics would be down here. We wanted to look at Nordics versus whatever was the furthest away from it up here. But it had to also give us a decent level of EMG. So if lunge had been here, we wouldn't have been comparing it to lunge. We're happy to compare it to either of these or any of those. So next step is to take that to the MRI scanner. And this result, this stuff's really, really fresh. We looked at, with the exception of the fact that we used a unilateral exercise, so we only had one leg behind the brace here. We basically had people scan, do this exercise. It was 5 sets of 10 with a 10 rep max load, and then back in the scanner. And here you can see the percentage changes in T2 relaxation times within the hamstring muscles. Bicep femoris, 90% increase in T2, so it's been pretty active. Bicep femoris short head, 17% change. Obviously, it's a knee flexor muscle. It's probably doing a little bit of activity just to brace your knee so you don't lock out and hurt your knee in hyperextension. But ultimately, it's contributing rather little. Semitendinosus, very similar levels of activation to bicep femoris long head. So a rather even activator of these two long heads. And semimembranosus, decent levels of activation as well, nearly 70%. Ultimately, this is, from our perspective, with the EMG and the MRI together, it's a pretty good all-round activator of hamstring muscles. Okay, so if we compare that then to Nordics. Again, we had pill scan, pre and post Nordics. Again, 5 sets of 10 on Nordics. And I've just got a raw image here. It's very pixelated. I apologise for the quality of it. But what you can see here at the back of the thigh. First of all, over here, gracilis is lit up like a Christmas tree. It's lighter in colour than other muscles. Gracilis really works hard in Nordics. Here you can see semitendinosus. Semitendinosus is lit up like a Christmas tree. And over here we've got semimem, here we've got bicep femoris long head, and here we've got bicep femoris short head. And in terms of the percentage activation changes here, by the way, we can't compare a Nordic to the back extension which we did previously. The back extension involves both concentric and eccentric phases, so from a metabolic cost perspective, it's hard work. There's a lot more glycolysis happening because you're doing the concentric phase of the movement, it's less efficient. Here we're just doing the eccentric phase of the movement, so the actual T2 changes aren't comparable, but the ratio of change between semitendinosus and the other muscles is the take-home message here. Ultimately, short head bicep femoris is a 22% change increase. Long head bicep femoris, a 15% change. Semitendinosus, 45% change. And semimembranosus, a 15% change. This is a very selective semitendinosus activator, or semitendinosus plus gracilis, that are quite highly activated. And that creates some really interesting questions because ultimately this is an exercise which has been shown in not just Arnie Arneson's study I mentioned earlier, the Peterson study that came along more recently, and just very recently, last week or two, Nick Vanderhorst from Holland has shown again in another of these 300 versus 300 studies that Nordics reduced injury, in this case again in amateur level soccer players. It's mainly bicep femoris injury that's occurring in those studies. Here's an exercise which rather spares bicep femoris long head, works semitendinosus hard, and yet still has some protective effects. So it raises a number of questions, how on earth is it so protective when semitendinosus is active? But the Sherman's study recently with Eric Vitrell, one of the co-authors, and they basically make an argument that semitendinosus, the topic of their paper is it teammates or competitors? And he makes the argument that semitendinosus and bicep femoris long head have a rather complicated relationship, and that perhaps the function of one is really influencing injury rates in the other. Right, so that's some of the recent work that we've been doing in the Brisbane arm of where we are. I wonder if we want a short break before we hand over, or give people 3 to 5 minutes to rattle their cage, stand up and move around. Afterwards, I'm going to hand over to Dave, and then Dave will let Ryan chat and shop.